Welcome to Allegedly Doesn't Replicate,
a podcast by the Institute for Replication,
where we put research to the test again.
In this episode, we'll talk to Professor Ryan Briggs and Vincent Aral about statistical power in political science. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast. Today, we have not one, but two incredible guests. We have Professor Ryan Briggs and Professor, I'm going to say Vincent, but it could be Vincent, from the University of Montreal and the University... Professor Briggs, you have to excuse my pronunciation. What could you pronounce your university?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I'm Ryan Briggs. I'm an associate professor of political science at the University of Guelph.
Perfect. I'm just afraid of mispronouncing everything at this point. My guess for this kind of stuff is horrible. Today, we're going to be discussing this amazing paper by both of them. And I think it's going to be an amazing discussion. And of course, we're always happy to have our chair, Bel Brodeur, here. So the four of us, for the ones that are not looking at the video, are going to be discussing this amazing paper. So professors, what don't you tell us a bit, not only about yourselves, but about the paper we're going to be taking a look at?
Do you want to go ahead, Ryan? I think you're...
Yeah, sure. Happy to. So the original motivation for me for this paper was a lot of theoretical work that was being done, just people kind of thinking through. It seems like a lot of our statistical tests have low power, and if you start to work through some of the implications of this, then you start to end up in some fairly scary places. But a lot of this work was just sort of like blackboard math, which should carry some weight, but it's not really obvious how much of that will actually translate into the real world. And so I had seen some other papers that were looking at either squarely this issue or some related issues. And this motivated me to send an email to Vincent, who I've been wanting to write with for a while, to see if he'd be willing to help me out on this project.
What I find interesting about the paper, and it's a paper about statistical power in political science. I think it relates to, what sociologists are doing, people in public health, economics, many different disciplines. And we find similar results. I think you would agree, in other disciplines, it's just low power. And we're going to come back to this and so on. But to me, political science was always a disciplines that have been thinking, yeah, we probably have power problems. And the reason, and maybe this is, one of the reasons you started this is this approach that's really popular, regression discontinuity design. And to me, this method just exploded 15 years ago in political science. It's used also in economics, other discipline. But basically looking at discontinuity and discarding 90% of your observations. And then the analysis is very local. So is this a motivation where you were interested in this project, or it's more just from a theoretical point of view, or just intellectual curiosity?
I mean, it is definitely a motivation. We've seen this rise of regression discontinuity, but it's important, I think, to highlight the fact that our paper doesn't just focus on this. It's really about drawing a broad portrait of the discipline. And in the papers that we survey, there's a bunch of methods, right? A lot of people do experiments. A lot of people do surveys. There's cross-national regressions in there. That's mostly older stuff, but there's a lot of that. So the data that we survey, the articles that we look at, are back from the 2000s, the early 2000s up to now. So it's a broad diversity of approaches, also a broad diversity of subfields in political science, right? The discipline is not unified. It's very diverse, both methodologically and theoretically. And so our paper covers a broad view of this, but definitely the developments that you thought about are prime motivation for us, because we do want to look back to assess the state of things, but we also want to look at the future, right? Think a bit about what are the implications of this. And before we move forward in the discussion, I just want to state the title of the paper, because I don't want to keep the suspense. The title says it all. It says research in political science is greatly underpowered, right? So that's the big punchline for us.
So what were your priors? We're going to go over the details of you've actually asked political scientists, people who publish in, I would argue, a very technical method specific journal, what they're thinking and what are their priors. But both of you, what were you thinking that you would uncover when you started this project? Maybe Ryan?
Yeah. So this question of priors is a good one, because we did try to get sort of broad field wide priors of people that are quite informed. And those were pretty different from my prior going in. I do think there were some people in political science that have been like very concerned about this for a long time. And those are people that basically like read Andrew Gelman's blog and took it very seriously. And that was a large motivation for me. And that was one factor that made me think that things might be dire, that power might be very, very low. And then we might have a very strong significance filter somewhere in the publication process. And this might lead to some really, really terrible problems. So I did go in thinking that things would be pretty bad. Also, I'd seen some prior empirical papers on this from economics that again like looked fairly grim and made me think the situation might be similarly bad in political science.
So what Ryan is hinting at is that we were worried that our priors were maybe not aligned with the rest of the discipline because we've been reading too many blogs, right? So what we did is we took a more systematic approach and we looked at we scraped the addresses of the emails of everyone who'd published in the journal Political Analysis, which is the premier political methodology journal. And we sent emails to all of them with a short survey asking them about their expectations about statistical power. And what we found is that even in the subset of the discipline that talks the most about power, or even in the subset of people who are most worried about these issues, still their expectations were way misaligned with our estimates. So this was kind of a, so for me, I kind of like Ryan, I had seen this other work. I came in with pretty bad expectations, but I think it turned out worse than I thought. And I think that's kind of the same for, I mean, we have the evidence that it's the same for the rest of the discipline, which is kind of a neat finding.
So why don't you tell us a bit about what you, not only the research question, what were you interested in, but also spoil us a bit about the results. What do you find?
Yeah, so I can kind of start us off here. So the tricky thing, if you're trying to analyze statistical power, is you need to have some like benchmark effect size that you're testing against, right? So we've been talking up to now about like high power, low power. It's always like power relative to some effect. And in a perfect world, authors would just tell you, ideally in some pre-registered format, even if it's observational work, before they sat down, they would talk about the effect sizes that they were ultimately interested in being able to detect. Maybe they would run through a power calculation. And if people did that reliably, then it would be really easy to go back and do power calculations against these minimum effects that they were interested in. No one does this. Like if, a few people do it with experimental work now, but like historically this isn't done. And what we wanted to do was try to look at power over like decades in the discipline. And so we needed some way to come up with these benchmark effect sizes like that. That's the main challenge of the paper. And so borrowing a strategy from past research by like Tom Stanley and Christo Kouliakos and other people, what we did is we collected every meta-analysis that had been published in political science from the year 2000 forward. We didn't go earlier than 2000 because there's very few meta-analyses, and also the data tend to not be available. The work isn't replicable in any like meaningful way for the most part. But we could get these meta-analyses from the year 2000 forward. And so we ended up with, there were 85 in our sample, only 46 had available data or results that we could sort of scrape like off the page. And then we could use these meta-analyses to do what you can do with a meta-analysis, come up with a population mean effect. And we could use that as then the benchmark effect size we were interested in for every test in that meta-analysis. So what we're basically asking when we're talking about power is we're asking, like, what is the power of this test to detect the consensus effect size in that research area? And so we do this a number of ways. We can talk more about that later because this is still kind of susceptible to issues around selection on significance or publication bias, though those should make power look better. But so even with our essentially like most generous way of approaching this, we find that power is very, very low to detect these consensus effect sizes. So only about 1 out of 5 tests had 50% power to detect the consensus effect size, and then only about 1 in 10 had 80% power. And 80% is your kind of benchmark that many people have anchored on, where this is the sort of thing that we should roughly be aiming for. So this isn't great. And then when power is low,
Terrible.
It's quite bad. And this has a lot of knock-on effects too, right? Because you might think if power is this low, then we'd never be getting significant results, right? But we also find like we have a lot of the results in our meta-analyses are statistically significant, which raises some real questions about how these two things can be true. Vincent, I don't know if you have anything to add on that.
This is super interesting because initially when I was still an undergrad and I was looking at power and what I remember from it, because, well, this is another discussion. We're not very well trained into thinking about power. I remember one of the things that that they always told me was like, power is an issue to detect false negatives, right? To get rid of false negatives. But then as you go into it, you realize that this is not the case at all. It's also a case about detecting, getting rid of false positives, right? So what would you say to people that are a bit relaxed when it comes to power issues? Like, how bad would you say the ratio of false positive is?
Well, I don't know if I can give you a ratio, but I think your intuition about this is correct, right? So the primary issue with power is that if you run, like, let's say you hire a bunch of people, a bunch of enumerators to run a survey, and it costs you a ton of money, but you have a small sample and low power, that like your main problem is going to be you're not going to be able to detect anything. So like the primary issue is that you're wasting your money. But where the knock-on effects come in is when you have this selection on significance filter, when you have publication bias, where either journals, reviewers, editors decide to only publish or at least primarily publish significant results, or even authors self-censor, right? So Abel knows about this. So this is a major problem. And when you combine these two things together, then you really make the problems a lot worse, and a lot worse in different directions. So not only are you going to start wasting your money, but then the studies that are going to be published, if you just look at this subset of published studies, then what you get is that these studies typically will have exaggerated effect sizes. So we have some ways of quantifying this. And our best estimate is that if you just look at the published significant estimates, they're probably about 3 times as large as what they should be. And also another consequence is that often if you're just publishing significant results and you have low power, you're going to get published results that are just the wrong sign, which is pretty bad, right? So I think your intuition is right. This is about wasting money, wasting energy, but this is also in combination with other pathologies of our discipline. This is really much worse.
For sure. Like, I don't want to call myself a political science by any means, any stretch of the imagination, but I do research on conflict. So I kind of play jump rope with that line between economics and political science a bit. And something that I've noticed in both of our disciplines is that since we run a lot of observational studies, we tend to report the stuff that's interesting after the fact. So sometimes what happens is that we just run low-powered studies and we find interesting stuff. And after the fact, we made up the story about how that can be true. So that is exactly what I was worried about, the exacerbation of the publication bias because of that rationalization of the effect. So I don't know if pre-analysis plans can get us to a better place just because the professions, and I'm talking about economics here, is not very familiar with pre-analysis plans for observational studies. So I don't know, what do you think is the next step towards mitigating that issue? I don't know if getting rid of it's something feasible, but mitigating it would be a nice first step.
So look, pre-analysis plans are great. I try to do them when I can, and I encourage others to do it. I don't know. I haven't seen a lot of really great research on the effects of it. I'm actually hoping that to convince Ryan to do some work on this myself. I don't think it'll be that hard. He seems interested. But so great for that. But I do want to say that in principle, I'm not that opposed to post-hoc theorizing. Like if you find something interesting, it's fine to develop a theory after that. It's just that as a discipline, and maybe like the two disciplines are in the same boat there, we have to have norms where these post-hoc theories are then tested on further data, right? And one thing that really struck me about this, the data collection part of our work, is that right, Ryan explained that in order to have our benchmark effects, we needed a meta-analysis, right? So we tried to collect all these meta-analysis. But what we found is that in political science, there are so few of them. It's crazy. I mean, since 2000, just finding 80 of them and only 45 or 46 with data is, to me, completely insane. So if you're going to do post-hoc theorizing like we do all the time, and like what you suggest might be problematic, then we have to encourage professionally, like we have to value this work of replicating, doing the study again, testing the same theory in a different context, and then aggregating those things. And that's currently in political science not something we do a lot of, and I feel that's really problematic.
Yeah, I want to reinforce both of those. So like we looked through about 3,000 journal years for articles. And so you think any journal year is going to publish a lot of articles, right? And we ended up finding like 80 meta-analyses, which tells you how rare it is for us to be working in like a close enough sort of vein or on a similar enough topic that we can actually like accumulate knowledge. And I think that this speaks to some like broader pathologies in political science and that are really quite bad. And then the other thing I want to reinforce is this sort of where the danger of post hoc theorizing lies. And it's just a labeling question, right? It's the fact that we present this stuff that we've done after the fact as not happening after the fact. And it's really this like labeling that causes people to believe that what we're showing is a test of something when that's just not the case, right? The theorizing came after. And I understand why people do this. I had one article where I was late enough in my sort of education that I knew not to do this. Like I knew this was a bad thing. And so I wrote up my article with the sort of main theory and the test, and it didn't come back the way I thought it would. And then I was very clear that after the fact, I did a bunch of these different things. And comments that I got fairly consistently in reviews was like, yeah, this article is like, it's fine, it's maybe worth publishing, but this format doesn't make sense. Like put the theory in the theory section and have your tests come after, you know? And so there was this like fairly constant pressure from reviewers who were well-meaning, but were trying to like shape this research into something that fit a model that I guess everyone understands. And I think like that really needs to change, because the problem with so much of this post-hoc theorizing is people just don't realize that it's not a test, that it's this exploratory thing. If you label it as such, I don't think it's a large.
Can I jump in? I think a lot of people might be listening, maybe people in political science, PhD students, etc., or people in general just listening and thinking, the research I do is good. The research I read like in top journals is really good. I don't think I have like power problems. I don't think I piak. I think I just do really good research, and good research is being published. And I think, my answer to this, and I would like to hear what's your answer to this, but I think most of the piaking that is happening is something that people are not even aware that they're actually doing this. They just follow what other people have done, make the same modeling decision. Maybe these people actually already piak, so you're piaking without even noticing. These projects are over a really long period of time. Over time, you make small decisions, but they sum up to something actually really big. And I think power is a bit like this. I think people don't realize how much power they have. Like we have this new reproduction that has been shared with the authors and we haven't released it. So I'm not going to see which paper it is, but basically they have a really big sample. But then when you look at the regression they're running, and it's a regression discontinuity design, but it could be anything else. But the effective sample size they're using to estimate the effect is like in few specification, one observation. There's like hundreds of thousands of people in the survey, but when they actually look at the effect, they never realize that actually they're estimating on like super small sample. And I think people just don't understand that. They're not trained to think about that stuff. They think I have really large sample, I've got tons of fixed effects, tons of controls, and I estimate a local average treatment effect, but you don't really realize how local things are. And I think that's why I think a lot of people misunderstand the amount of lack of power in our disciplines. They just don't understand that, yeah, we have larger and larger sample size, but actually power does not necessarily mean it's increasing over time. We're answering questions that are more and more about like the mechanism and something like really tight and really hard to answer. So to me, like, I'm not surprised that people's priors are off. And I think it's the same about piaking. It's the same about like a lot of things. it's just happening at like a level that people are not even conscious it's happening. Do you agree with this, or do you think like people in general just don't really care about power and are just like it's just a lack of training? To me, like training would not even necessarily like fully solve the problem, because I think just unconsciously, like you don't really realize what you're actually doing.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. One thing I'll say though is the reaction to this paper has been overwhelmingly positive. People seem to really find it interesting and they are curious and they want to learn more about it. And my really strong sense is that just people want to do good work and they want to find the truth. And so I think maybe when you say it's not about training, that's the only place I would push back a little bit, because I do think that people want to do good work and they want to learn and they want to do better.
Mhm.
It's just that, like you say, like sometimes you inherit decisions that are p-hacked already, and that's complicated to trace back. So long-running projects, those are really good points, and we can add more. So in political science, it's been a big trend in the last 15, 20 years to run survey experiments, right? Where you present some text or some video and you change a tiny thing to it. But if the treatment is really small, if it's just a small tweak to a sentence, like that's a very weak stimulus. So how can you expect there to be really strong effects to this? So power is a function of many things, right? Yes, it's your sample size. It can be your effective sample size, like what you discussed. It's about the strength of your stimulus, about the quality of your measurement model. It's about so many things that I can be optimistic and say it's about training, but you have to train along many angles, which makes this a really hard problem.
I can't hear you.
Okay, now my bad. Can you clarify why the stimulus matters for statistical power? I think a lot of people are not going to understand like how it relates to effect size you're going to estimate and how important is actually, the effect size you're trying to estimate, or why it would matter for online experiments.
Right. Well, it's pretty simple, right? So when Ryan was describing how we went about doing this, the main difficulty for us was to find a benchmark effect size that we were going to test the statistical power of our procedures against. That benchmark number, that benchmark effect in our case, was the consensus estimate from the literature. It was the meta-analytic assessment. But of course, if this benchmark effect is bigger, it's going to be easier to detect it with a statistical test. And it's the same size in the context of an experiment or any test. If the effect size is really big, then you typically need fewer observations to detect it. So if you give really weak stimulus to your participants, you can expect that the effect sizes are going to be small, and therefore you can expect that your statistical power is going to be lower typically.
Are things getting better over time? Do you guys look over time and what's actually happening?
Yeah, things are getting better over time, but it's really slow. So in our earliest period, median power is under 10%. It's like, I don't know, 8 or something percent. And then median power ends at, I don't know, like between 10 and 15%. So that's, if you can see it going up slowly as you kind of look, but it's really minor. That's median power. What's interesting is mean power starts higher and goes up more dramatically. And so like one thing that comes out of our research when we try to disaggregate this and not just say like, what's power at the median, pulling everything or something. When you actually pull it apart and look at these different research areas, you see something like 80% of all of the research areas having very, very low. And then you see something like 10 to 20% that just seem amazing. And this is the same pattern that jumps out in economics, which is quite interesting. Yep. And so, we can tell different stories about like what is generating this, but one story that you can tell is that there's this fifth of the discipline that's studying these large, durable, fairly homogeneous effects. They really exist. They're learning about them. And they're testing them with, high enough powered tests, which would mean the other 80% isn't. Doesn't mean the effects are like zero and they're necessarily chasing noise, though you could say it that way. It could also be that these effects are just like really heterogeneous. They're also kind of small. Some of them are positive, some of them are negative. When you pull them in a meta-analysis, you get basically zero. And so it's very hard to build knowledge about these like maybe small fleeting effects, even though maybe individual authors are picking up real things, or maybe they're kind of chasing noise. Like that's also possible. We can't really differentiate those.
So do you think it's possible to sort of tell people like, here's the literature I would trust, here's another one I would not necessarily trust. And I'm asking this just because I've been doing work on like p-hacking and like, many other open science topics, let's say for 10, 15 years. And then you start talking to like, policymakers and people interested in, just like, what do we learn out of this? And it's really hard, I think, in general, to be able to, like, for a single study, I think it's literally impossible to say like, well, that paper, like, you cannot trust. Like, it really suffers from like tons of problems. And I think it's incredibly hard to do that. I know some people are trying to develop tools to try to do this, especially in psychology. I don't necessarily buy into all of that. I think it's possible when you look at like large set of studies to try to tell patterns like what you're doing in this one. But like, do we have any ideas, or like when you look at these different meta-analysis, are there ones that just like pops to mind, or you would be like, I definitely don't buy this. We don't have the tools, or we don't have like the sample size, or the effect is just like all over the place. Do you think like we can say something like this, or do you think it's just, even at that point, it would be really hard with the tools that we have?
So I'm not going to like name
No,
research
yeah.
areas that I think are either very strong or very weak, but I will say we found this spread of this sort of minority, very high power, majority, very low, across every subfield. We only have so many ways that we can cut the data before we run into like strong issues of power.
Yep.
But it does seem like it's not an issue of, I don't know, American politics doing well and international relations doing poorly or something like this. It does just seem to be fairly spread out. That said, like I do think it's probably the case that you can, if someone wanted to, they could go through the meta-analyses and say, look, like it does seem like we're learning something. There are these fairly consistent, homogeneous, similarly sized effects in well-powered studies. And we're learning something real here. So I do think, if one wanted to do that exercise, you really could go through and probably pull some out that feel more reliable and probably would be more reliable.
I wanted to ask something more like philosophical, in the sense of what has been the reaction from some people in the profession that are way more normative about the questions we ask, and they believe, for example, that not every question can be answered via data and this kind of stuff. What has been their reaction to your paper? Was it like I've been telling you all along, or something like along those lines?
Vincent, I don't know if you have any like this. I've had a few people, with like sort of jokey responses about the value of qualitative work or something like this. And I think there's honestly something to that. Like, I do think it's the case that there are research questions that we would like to ask and answer with, quantitative data, and we don't have the data. And like, it would just be way better to go and interview some people. And we would just learn more about what's going on by running interviews or doing process tracing and collecting whatever archival data you can. Like, I think it just is the case that there are some questions that we really want answers to that it's going to be very challenging to answer in a high quality way with quantitative data. And so I think there is something to the idea that like, then you should go and answer it a different way. That might mean
that's the famous quote from John Tukey, right? The combination of some data and an aching desire for an answer does not ensure that a reasonable answer can be extracted from a given body of data. That's the problem. Sometimes we just
Completely
have to be
agree.
humble.
The reason I ask is that my impression is that these low-power studies have immense agenda-setting power. Not pun intended, but in the sense that it's very easy to find like an outlier driving this relationship and getting published because of publication bias. But then when subsequent studies are trying to test the same questions, they are not going to find the relationship and they are not going to get published. So this one paper sticks into the literature, driving research towards certain areas. And then it's very hard for us as a profession to go to that place and get the river back into what it should be. So I wonder if sometimes these underpowered studies is not only like a harmless thing, oh, someone got a publication, but that was like noise, but is driving the profession towards places in which it's hard for us to recover and get back into the rails.
Yeah, there's definitely a first mover advantage there. That's a real thing. It's a problematic thing in some ways, and for interested listeners. I know you've discussed this topic on a previous which is great. So yes, that's a problem. And frankly, I'm kind of at a loss about how to incentivize more people to do these replications, to test these things again. So that's kind of an obvious path forward for me, but I'm not sure how we have to start giving tenure to people who mostly specialize in doing replication, and I don't know how I'm going to convince my colleagues to do this. A kind of related point, which is really a problem with political science that I see, is that not only are there very little incentives to replicate work, but there are very strong incentives to do the exact opposite. So there's very strong incentives to differentiate your contribution, both theoretically and empirically. So there's this kind of norm in political science and top journals where you have to innovate in data, in theory, or in modeling. And so a lot of the papers end up being a slightly different theory that makes slightly different predictions, but not really sometimes, but the theory is a bit different. The test is unique. And so we have a bunch of papers that are each their islands, right? There's nothing like them because they've been conceived for that express purpose of being different, of being original. And so it's not even that we don't get tenure for replicating stuff. It's that you get it for doing the exact opposite, for differentiation, which I think is a real problem.
I mean, if I don't want to play the devil's advocate, but I'll do it. I think, you would talk to many editors at top journals and they would tell you, well, we're the top journal, so we publish things that make a contribution that is large enough from a theoretical point of view or empirics or whatever. And if you want to publish something that confirms a previous result, maybe in a different setting, or if you want to publish a replication, or if you want to, publish a study where the contribution is, let's say, more modest, there's hundreds of other journals where you can do that are lower ranked. I have problems with me even saying this. I don't necessarily agree with this, but I think, your point about like, what do we do as a discipline? There's plus one. There's journals that will accept your paper just based on, have you done a good job? Is it, methodologically sound? And if you submit there and you don't necessarily make a groundbreaking like contribution, they will accept the paper. So I guess question to both of you, like, is it okay that we have some really elite top journals that only publish like things that are supposed to find new results, and then we have all these top fields and other journals that actually publish replications, publish results that are not necessarily as interesting, and then we don't necessarily have a publication bias? Again, don't necessarily agree with this. I don't. And what about plus one? What about journals like this? Should we have like political science journals that pretty much are going to accept anything that just makes sense from a methodological point of view and just answers an interesting research question no matter what you find? What do you guys think?
So I think an important piece of information that like you and probably everyone listening is aware of, but it's worth kind of flagging, is just the current like job and career landscape is such that to say that there's some journals that will specialize in these very new results and other journals won't, and then you can kind of publish anywhere you want, I think it kind of underplays the very strong incentives that especially early career people have to get articles in these journals. And I think given the selection rules that these journals have tended to have in practice, it has encouraged people to either produce work that is, I like the island metaphor, right? The sort of standalone thing where we have trouble accumulating. And so you end up with thousands of journal years of publications and like 80 some meta-analyses, which I think is a problem. And that's the good case. I think the bad case is you end up with work that is very often the wrong sign relative to the true effect or vastly inflated. And we see this across many disciplines, right? These decline effects are real. So when you do have cases where people go and carefully run experiments all over again, trying to test a previous result, very often the effect you find is smaller. You would expect this if you had these sort of bad selection mechanisms. And so I do put a lot of this on the people that run top journals. I don't think that they need to have the selection rules that they currently have in practice. And the optimistic thing that I will say is it is now the case that some of the top journals, quote unquote, in political science now have registered reports. So APSR is now accepting them. The Journal of Politics kind of led the way for the top journals there. The Journal of Experimental Political Science, I believe, has had them for longer. And I think like my hope is that once we see more of this and see that, yes, we can evaluate research before we see results or even run the experiment, this is in fact way better, because when you do it this way, you can take the reviewer feedback and actually do things with it, like change the way you'll run your experiment, right? Like, I think that once we see that this can lead to a better process for everybody, and then often to us not getting significant results, and sometimes, or like, very precise null results even, right? So power was high, but we still didn't find something. My hope is that that can start to move us towards trying to think through better selection mechanisms for these top journals. And I think it makes sense to try to select in these, I think we're going to have these elite journals for a long time. I think they should be selecting on how much people are expected to update on a given result. And I think that that is a different thing than is the result significant.
But wait, like you just said, but then like, there's a novel component still, right? Like if what you're trying to maximize.
Not necessarily, right? If everyone thinks that there's some effect, and then someone runs a very careful replication and finds a precise null, that should cause a big update. And I'm not saying this solves everything, but I think that this is I think this will be a better rule. If we need to have the current elite set up and we need to then say it's like the most important work, I think there's a better way in practice to decide what is the most important than the current rules that we have.
Fair enough.
I mean, in some ideal world, we wouldn't have any of this, right? We would just post our work online and people would just be able to like add comments, and then it would sort of organically create a organic system that ends up like drawing attention to where there's stronger work, and we can see it. Like it's easy to imagine ways that if we were to break the journal system fully, we could end up with something that respects the fact that we have the internet. But I don't see that in the short term or medium term.
So if I get this correctly, you think that the change should come from the editors of these top journals. How do we incentivize those editors to believe in this stuff? Like, how do you think that change comes about?
Well, you can vote for some of these journals, right? Like some of these journals are run by associations. And like, I'm not a political scientist, but I think, they mostly believe in democracy. And so I think you can. And I think in psychology, you see what's happening with psychological science, the leading journal, of the APA, they voted for a new editor who deeply believes in open science. So change can come through this. If that's what you care about, use your vote, I would say. I'll let Vincent and Ryan maybe express different opinions.
No, I think that's right. To be fair to the editors and to the bigwigs of our discipline, things have been improving, at least institutionally. We've seen, I was very encouraged by a recent statement by the APSR editors, that's the leading journal of political science, who've put in a lot of really good ideas on paper, and that's going to translate into policy. And I think things are moving forward. So I'm optimistic about the future, thanks in part to the work of the committed open science people. So I'm things are going to improve, is my prediction.
No, they are. I mean, you just look at the way things were 10, 15 years ago. I mean, some people are maybe too young to remember this, but it was just wild. Like, like authors need to provide their data in code. That's just like a huge improvement. And you would think, well, of course. Well, yeah, no, it's because you're within your silo and you're within economics and political science, who are, I would say, two fields that are way ahead of many other disciplines in terms of like data sharing. And I think it comes from the fact that we can actually share data. It's like, it's not like we're amazing people. I think it's just because we're using a lot of secondary data. But I think if you look at what we're doing in comparison to, let's say, management, almost impossible to find management journals that actually have a data and code availability policy. And when they do, like management science, and I don't want to criticize necessarily that specific journal because they're actually doing more than most journals in management, but they had to reach out sort of a compromise, and their data and code policy is basically, yeah, sure, you should release your data and codes, but nobody can do anything with it. And if you write a comment or you try to reproduce it or change anything, you can only submit a comment to the journal, management science. So if you look at, political science just as a discipline in terms of like register reports, data availability policy, and all these things, like, editors are actually pretty much like leaders in a sense of like, promoting open science practices.
And when we look at when we did our data collection, it's obvious that the data availability improved over time.
Yes.
For the older meta-analyses, it was basically impossible. We had no hope of finding them, and it really increased over time. So that's great. And like, this is a Institute for Replication podcast, but the work that you guys are doing would have been impossible just
Yes.
5-10 years ago, completely impossible. And I think I love what you're doing, because one of the major kind of norms that need to change is to first make systematic replication a normal practice, right? Like, we need to find these mistakes. We need to confirm that there are no mistakes as well, right? Both sides. But also, like, we need to show that replication can be good news, right? If there are no mistakes, it's great. So we need to get used to that, and also like, just reduce the stigma of making mistakes. One of my big hobbies I do, like, on the side, is like, I code open source software. Like, I'm really big into that. So I spend a lot of hours on it, and I'm pretty good at coding, but I make mistakes all the time. And so, like, if someone who codes like hours every day makes mistakes all the time, for sure other people do as well. So like, we need this kind of mass production of replication like you guys do in order to just normalize all this. Like, we make mistakes, we then recognize our mistakes and move forward. Of course, that's easier to say with tenure like me, but I really appreciate the work that you're doing is what I'm saying, I guess.
There's a lot of people criticizing tenure, and I used to, I'll be frank. The moment I launched the Institute is when I got tenure. And I was like, screw this, now I can do whatever I want. So like, I do believe some people use tenure in a way that makes sense. You just go for something way riskier than you would have before. And I think, there are benefits to this. But to your point, the Institute like 10 years ago would never have happened. Would have been impossible. And that, like, we receive emails all the time from you guys, and we truly appreciate. We really want to bring the Institute to your field or discipline. We can't. And we've been trying, and we would love to do more disciplines. We cannot. There's just no data in codes. And when we email people, they don't want to share data in codes, and it's just literally impossible. So it's easy to criticize editors, but at the same time, we're able to do what we do because of the editors and the policies that they actually do implement. But Vincent, you love coding. I love that. And what do you think of like code review, which is just not a thing in academia? And it's so popular, like when you go in the private sector or like when you talk to engineering. And like, what's your take on this? Like, why do people don't do code review? Do you do it to some extent when you do all these things? And like, you say that sometimes you find coding errors. Are you like code reviewing someone else's work and someone is reviewing your codes and things like this? Or like, what's your process or just your thoughts in general on code review?
All for code review, for sure. Like, when I put code up on GitHub and some random dude in Germany comes in and tells me that I made mistakes, I love it. It's great. It's free labor that's improving my work. In my research, to be perfectly honest, I feel that I haven't done enough of code review, and it's partly because of, I guess, like, skill complementarity between the co-authors, right? I'm often like the code guy. In these latest projects, it's been really fun with Ryan, because he codes, and like, we've been doing a lot of mutual code review, and I think that's really improved our work tremendously. We found mistakes in each other's stuff, and no, all in favor. I mean, the real problem is, if you want to systematize this and make it really professional, you need money. Like, you need to hire some real engineers, and that's hard. Like, our funding situation is not such that we can really afford to do that, or maybe we need to change that.
So why do we need money? Like, to me, like, I'm gonna say it's a bit like a lame excuse. Like, right now we have a system in which we referee each other's work for free, which you say to anyone outside of academia, like, that we're doing this, people think we're completely insane, and that we actually pay money to publish our work and we lose our intellectual, like, I think a lot of people criticize the system, but you could think of a system in which code review is just a thing. You could have a platform. I'm not developing that platform, by the way, but you could have a platform in which you just say, hey, here's my code. Someone needs to review it. And then if you review someone else's code, someone else reviews your code. Or it sounds like so simple and so easy. And yet I just don't really see any appetite for this or this type of conversation. Or maybe I'm not looking at the right place, and maybe this is happening.
I wanted to
Oh,
say
that's
something.
fine.
I completely agree with Vincent. It's astonishing the amount of mistakes we make when we're coding. And I think if we wanted to get a page out of the engineer's handbook, it should be to get rid of the shame associated with making mistakes when it comes to coding, because we all do it. Like, we all commit mistakes. It's part of the job, right? The problem is that when those mistakes end up altering the conclusions of a paper. And one possible solution is something that you mentioned a couple episodes ago about, like, we should get reviewers to see the code. And of course, senior professors are gonna be very hard to convince when it comes to do code review, but then junior scholars are gonna be all for it. Imagine a world when you send you have two types of reviewers, right? The typical reviewer, where you set the PDF and they go after the specification or the idea or the ethos of the paper as it is. And then you have a second type of reviewer, which is a more junior scholar that has the time and it's willing to go line by line, taking a look at the cleaning, taking a look at the regression part of it. I think it's part of the division of labor. As economists, we preach and we say we believe in division of labor. When rubber hits the ground, I don't think we do. Not as much as we like to say, you know?
Yeah, so a few reactions on this. So first, I agree with you. It's a major problem. And part of the problem is that the distribution of code mistakes that get reported and fixed is probably not random, right? So we're much more likely to look for a problem if the result is surprising than if it confirms our prior or the result that we want to publish. It's not, it's just pure technical random noise mistakes. So that's a big problem, and that's why I worry about it. Now you can think about the review at at several stages, right? So before even submission, which is what I was talking about earlier. So you hire some research engineer who's on staff, maybe in a kind of a lab model, right? And that person goes through every line to do this. That costs money. That's what I was talking about. But then what you both mentioned makes total sense to me. So for me, on submission, you should send your code and data. So peer reviewers should have access to this for sure. Now, do we want to institutionalize a different process to have code review? I think that would be great. But the problem is time there, right? Like, I think editors are already having lots of problems finding peer reviewers, and reviewing a paper can take, I don't know how long, probably depends on the reviewer, but reviewing the code for a paper is many, many hours. So, I mean, where are you going to find this time? I don't know, but I do agree in principle, it would be awesome.
For sure. I think that's the main problem, especially for lower ranking journals, like finding someone who's willing to put on the time. Like, I mean, if I get a review request from the AR or HAPS, me as a junior scholar, I would jump into it, right? But then if I get a review request for, I don't know, the local newspaper of Colombia, perhaps I won't, you know what I mean? So it's a commitment issue.
Guys, thanks a lot. This was a super interesting conversation. Vincent, you want to add something before we wrap up? Go for it.
Yeah, just before we wrap up, I want to shout out our co-authors who were awesome on this. So this work was really based on prior work that Tom Stanley and Chris Dukuliagos had done in economics and elsewhere in psychology as well. And also Marco Avinia, who did a tremendous amount of work on this paper and is a brilliant PhD student. So it was really great to work with them. And thank you both for the interview. That was fun.
No, thanks for joining. Hopefully we can do this again.
Yeah, it's been super interesting. I always enjoy talking to other disciplines a lot, and you guys have been a lot of fun. Thank you for spending the time for us, and hopefully we have you in a future episode.
Thank you so much, and thanks for all the work that you do at the Institute. I think it's really like leading the way on a lot of this and pushing everybody to do better, more careful work, and like working to change norms that really need to be changed. So I really appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.
See you.